Alright guys, today we're back with another Blender tutorial looking at some more tools and options that you have in Blender for helping shape a model, and then towards the end we're also going to play with materials and textures. So to do this one I'm just going to start on some basic shapes because working on our dog that we already have or your other animal might be quite hard. So we're going to start with just some basic objects in the scene. The first thing I'm going to go through is sculpting. Now, sculpting is a different way to build your model. The reason we're going to look at sculpting is you might want to add to your model that you've already made, where you might not be happy with the edges being super sharp. So we're going to look at how you might round or improve the shape of an object. So to do this, I'm just going to start with a sphere in my workspace. I'm going to make it quite big just so you can see. Now, when we're working on sculpting, some important things to look at with our sphere, we look at the properties of the object. Each one of these little surfaces or little bits of geometry can be edited. Now, when we go into sculpt mode, you'll notice one of the things it tends to do is it starts showing you like a preview of a material. And by default, it's put a brown material on it. Now, this happens even in solid mode when I go into Sculpt or UV Editor or texture painting. But if I just go up here, click on my drop down arrow where it says viewport, because we're in the viewport. So what do I want to see in the viewport? There are some different options there. So it's trying to show you more realistically what your object might look like under different lighting or different settings. So you can work with something turned on if you want, or if you just want it to go back to the plane, you can go back to studio. Now in sculpt mode, so I changed to sculpting up the top, a couple of things to notice. So we have a toolbar that looks very different down the side with lots and lots of different kind of tools you could use, because essentially sculpt mode is for working like you're crafting a sculpture out of clay. Up the top here we have the radius of the brush, so you can either adjust it there, so it's set to 50 pixels by default. Obviously the bigger you have it, the more effect it has. If I press F on my keyboard, I can also resize that brush really quickly. Just by pressing F and moving my mouse in and outside, that's a shortcut key for resizing the brush. With strength, that's how strong the effect is. So the stronger it is, the more dramatic you'll notice the change, more instantaneously. Okay. Now, at the moment, my default brush, which you'll often use the most, is the draw brush. If I just started working on this object, you'll see as I drag it across like a paintbrush, it starts to stretch that geometry that's already there. So it's starting to stretch, and yes, I can build this layer up because this is just my draw brush, but it's essentially just stretching my geometry. The other thing you'll notice is that it's working with some symmetry at the moment. So at the moment, the symmetry, if I go over to my toolbar on the right hand side, is mirroring everything I do in the X plane. Now I can change that just by turning it off. So I can go Y plane, and then it mirrors everything I'm doing in the Y plane or the Z plane. And you can have all three turned on if you like, but I tend to use just one. Okay, so at the moment, all it's doing when I'm using this tool is it's merely stretching the already existing geometry. Now, that might look okay, but eventually you're going to come up with some problems in your model where you get these really sharp edges which you can't do a lot with. So what we're actually going to turn on is something called dynamic typology. And what this does is it will add more geometry to the object. So I'm just going to undo the steps that I've taken, just pressing Ctrl Z. So you'll notice here, as I said, when I stretch it, it's literally just stretching the existing geometry or existing vertices and stuff like that. If I come over to my toolbar on the right hand side, so make sure I'm on the tool setting, and come down to where it says Dyntopo or Dynatopo, you might find it, depending on your computer, has different options. And I'm going to turn that on. And it'll come up vertex data detected. It will not preserve existing data. That's fine. So I'll press OK. Basically means it's going to add more to your model. So you'll notice now if I start using my draw tool, it's adding extra to my mold. So instead of deforming the original, it's starting to add extra to my model. Now, with the draw tool, it's basically like layering it on. So you can see I'm just building on the layer. But what if I wanted to cut away? So if I wanted to cut away, you can use the exact same tool. So at the moment, it's doing add. Over on the toolbar, you'll see direction, it says add. I could change to subtract here, and that will mean it starts to cut instead. So you can notice as I stroke, just like sculpting with clay, it cuts away. The other option I have is if I hold, say I'm on add mode, so I'm adding that back in. If I hold control as I drag, it actually does the opposite to whatever mode I'm in. So I don't have to go over and switch. So if I'm on add and I hold control, it does a subtract. If I'm on subtract and I hold control, it does an add. Now you can see with this we can create some pretty unique shapes. And this is just drawing. Okay. Now if I cut too far there, you can see I've actually almost cut a hole right through my object, which I don't want to do. So I'm just going to fill it back in. Now that's just with the draw tool. There are lots of them here. They tend to do different things. So inflate tends to make things come out like in a circular motion. So it stretches us looking rather bulbous. Then we have options like blob. So again, that works just on one particular area, but it makes it stand out more and more like a blob. We have things like crease. So if I cut it, it makes a divot in my shape. So as I run it, it makes a crease between the geometry pieces. We then have some more advanced ones. So you have smooth. So what smooth does is it basically, as it kind of averages out, but you can see I can quite quickly smooth down sharp points. So if I was to run it over these points here, it starts to remove them and smooth them down. And you'll see it'll change all that geometry. So my original circle now is looking quite different. If I was to turn this into like a funky looking alien head, it's starting to get kind of a, or even like a fly or a wasp. This might be my head. Then got flatten. So flatten is even more dramatic than smooth, and it literally makes a flat space on the level. You have fill options and scrape options, which are again different tools. And there is like lots of videos out there. So scrape tends to remove what's already just been placed on top. So it's kind of like cutting away. Instead of doing an add, it cuts away a lot neater without affecting the underlying like shape. You then have tools like grab. So what grab will do is it'll grab the vertex I click on and stretch it. So you can see, again, it treats the mesh quite differently. It actually stretches those shapes without making new ones. The one underneath that is called a snake hook. Now what a snake hook works similar to a grab, but as I drag it and shape it, it actually adds the typology in. So it's a good one for making kind of like horns and things like that, because you can see it, you can make some quite funky shapes as you grab one point. And I can go back and grab this point and twist it and do lots with it. But you can get some pretty extreme and very different looking shapes. Okay, there's also quite a few other ones down here. You might not play with them all, but when you're modeling, sculpt mode is quite handy. One thing to have a look at, and you'll notice how different this is from an original circle, is if I go into my viewport shading now, you'll see there's so much more geometry there. So there's a lot more vertices and corners that you can see, and a lot more triangles have been added. Just to compare that to a normal shape, if I added in another object, so I've got to go back to object mode. Well, I do it in edit mode. In edit mode, you can see how many vertices there are on this one. Now, if I just add in a normal circle for you to compare, or a normal UV sphere, I'm just going to move it. so it's out of the way. You can see that's what I started with. Now, on this one, if I was to use that without dynamic topology turned on, what it will do is my sphere will still only have that many faces at the end. With dynamic topology, obviously it's added a lot more objects to my scene because it's adding a lot more geometry to your model. I'm just going to go back into object mode, and I'm actually going to delete this object here because I no longer want it. So I'm going to use B for box select and drag around this object. Now, because I've got X-ray turned on, it means it automatically selects vertices at the back. If I didn't have it on, and I did a drag select, it'll only select the stuff on the front, but there's a whole heap that I miss. So I'd have to do another selection to add to it. Now, a lot easier just to have X-ray mode turned on for doing this selection. Hold B, select everything, delete, and it's gone. Right, now what we're going to play with now is we're going to look at some different things that you might do. So I'm just going to add a new object to my scene, new UV sphere, and reposition it so you can see it. And I might even we'll use some planes underneath, just so it has an object to sit on top of. And I'll scale that out, so pressing S, turn off X-ray mode so it looks flat. Then I'm going to duplicate this sphere, so move this one over here, Shift D, just move it over this way, and Shift D over here. Position wise, not too worried, because we're just going to be playing with some more material settings. Right, so some of you already have looked at different things that you can do with objects in terms of materials. Now, one thing we can do, which I haven't covered yet, is at the moment, if I click on an object and right click, it'll bring up the options for the object. So I can reset its origin points. But what I'm actually going to do is go shade smooth. And you'll notice it hides my topology. Now, when we're experimenting with materials, I don't want to see all my edges, so I want it to be smooth. But at different times, you can click on it and go shade flat, and it'll bring back the geometry. So I'm going to make them all smooth just while I play with some different material settings. Now, we've looked at adding a material before by selecting an object, clicking on material and going new. So I'm just going to do that for my first one. And I'm going to go into shading so I can see my material. Now, automatically, default, you can see that only one of these objects has material on it if I look at it through the rendered view, and its base color is white. Now, what we're going to do this time is we're going to use nodes. So if I click on this blue button, you'll see, well, yours might be a different color, but it's now changed color and it's showing there's a link so that I'm using nodes. So to play with my nodes, I'm going to click on shading, taking it to the shading workspace. Now what that does is this is where we can play around with how objects react to light, how they create light, and how they like their textures on the object. And you can pick down here, you'll see you might have by default this glass ball. That's the world that's showing you reflections of. So I can choose by going up to this arrow and turn on like my lights from my scene. I can also choose what the reflection is, so you might change to get slightly different colors, but it will show you a slightly different reflection in your object if your object can reflect light. What it's created down the bottom here is this is my node editor. And if I press Control and Spacebar, it actually makes it full screen. So because I've created a material on that object, you'll see there's the material name, just like it was before. I can rename it here, so I'm going to go Object 1 and press Enter. Now, these are how we determine how our object acts. Now, all these settings were on our materials toolbar, but basically for any object, the shader, so this is the shader in green, needs to be linked to the output. So I'm going to start with Control spacebar again, just to view it. So this is my first object. Now, to simply change the color like we've done in the past, I go base color and pick a different color. We should see this object change. So we're not seeing it at the moment. Sorry, I didn't actually apply the color to, this is my world instead of my object. So click on my object. It says I'm using nodes. Base color, red. That's interesting. Just going to take my lighting up, click on my object again, go new. Oh, now it seems to be working. There we go. And I added it back on in this node editor. And I'm just going to rename this object 1. So if I make this bigger again, you can see base color. So base color is the color you see on the outside, but we're going to look at some other options. So for this first one, I might like to, at the moment you can see the ball's not really reacting to light, it's reflecting a tiny bit, but this is where I might want to make my object more metallic. So if I play with metallic, I'm just going to make this a value of 1, go back, you'll see that my ball is starting to look a bit more metallic. I'm going to turn off the X-ray too so I can't see it. But my ball starts to have a bit more of a reflection of the light to it. It's starting to look a bit more metal. I can also play with something like the roughness. So I want my ball to be a lot smoother, so I'm going to turn the roughness down, and you'll notice the edges start to look a lot smoother. So it doesn't have that rough edge on the actual ball now. In terms of other things I could play with, before we played with transmission. Transmission made it see-through, but I might turn up my tint. And you'll see you start to get a bit more glossy looking object. Now because my ground here at the moment doesn't have a color, or none of my other balls, I'm not going to really notice too much unless I added a light to my scene. So I add a light. And I'll probably need to go back to my layout mode. I'm just going to move my light so it's directly above my blue ball. And then I'll go back into the shader. So you see now, even on the top where I had the light, it's creating a reflection. I make my light more powerful because this is a point light, and I might make my radius a bit bigger. Or even if I turn it into a sun, and you'll notice it makes everything super bright. I'm just going to turn it down a bit so it's not too bright. But you'll notice my object acts differently depending on my light source. Okay. Now, in the node editor down here, we have lots of options for different nodes. So if I go to add, or same as before, Shift A, and I can add, there's lots of different types of shaders. So if I went to a glossy shader, I'm just going to put it here. I'm going to make my color pink, for example. Now what you'll notice is we have 2 green ones, but at the moment my ball is still blue. So if I wanted that to change, I need to connect my glossy BDSF to the material output. So if I drag this, and this piece between here and here is called a noodle. So if I drag the noodle from here and click to there, you'll notice if I go back here, my objects has changed. Now that's a pre-made glossy appearance, and again I can play with the roughness, and I can make my object more glossy or less glossy depending on what you're after, and the roughness. Now there are quite a few different shaders you could use. So again, I could add another one. If I went to a glass shader, again, I'll just give this one a light color. And all I do is change that to there. And if I click back, you'll see I get a different result each time. So there's lots of these shaders built in here, and the only way you work them out is by experimenting. I'm just going to delete these two and reconnect my node there. Now, what I can also add through my node editor, and I can move these around at any stage, is textures. So I'm going to go Shift A and add a texture. So I'm going to start with just something quite simple. We might go bricks. So pre-made brick texture. Now you notice here the color of the inputs are different. So with my bricks, if I apply this to the base color and have a look at my object, you'll notice that it actually removes the color, which I might not want to do. So instead, don't want my color to be connected, so just click on where it was connected, let go, it's disconnected. Instead, with what I really want from my bricks is I want to affect the roughness of my shape. So I'm going to drag the second one down, roughness to roughness. Now you might notice now that it's added in my brick pattern. Now you'll see it's starting to look a bit textured, but one of the things that came across was, I'll just reconnect the color so you can see it, is that the black and grey and white lines become our texture. But because I don't have the color information connected, the color doesn't come through, but my roughness does. Now if I turn up my roughness and play with it over here, so I might change my scale a bit, and I can change the size and the width of the bricks and the row heights, but I can also change the colors. So I can make it the offset a bit wider. I can also play with the scale of my bricks, so bigger and smaller. I can play with the squash, so how it fits. So it might squash more in one direction. I can play with the mortar size, so make it super thick or super thin. But depending on how you play with it, we can start to add texture to our objects. And if I change the color just to something a bit lighter, you'll see my object's starting to look like it actually has something on the ball. Now for this, you might want to experiment with some different textures. So if I click on my second material, so I'm going to leave that ball with like a brick texture. Click on my new object, and if I'm in the shader, I'll need to add. So if I just clicked here and went object 101, it adds the one from there. Now I don't want that, so I'm going to go new. And by default, it adds a principal and a material output. Now I'm going to add in another slightly different texture. So I might add in a sky texture. And what sky textures will do, if I link my base colors, is I can play with the roughness. It might not work on my sphere. Actually, what we'll do, we'll add a different texture in. We'll add in, let's go a Rooney texture. So again, I'm going to make this affect the roughness of my ball, and I'll add a color. So you can see I'm starting to get a slightly different look. So it cells, and I can play with my intensity on here, and I'll start to get appearances that don't look as much like a flat ball. Now at the moment my object, even though I'm adding on a texture, it's not actually affecting the shape of the object, even though it may appear differently. You can actually add objects which change the shape. So they come under as a vector and a bump. So if I add a bump in, then you'll notice here, if I add my bump in to connect that to my vector, I start to get a slightly different look. And I can play with it. So if I go invert, it changes from affecting the black to the white. And I can play with stuff like the distance and the height, but we can start to layer one after the other. Okay, so you can play with textures like that. Now the other thing we can do, and I wanted to show you with this one, is adding in something called hair. So we can also add in particles like hair and edit hair. So if I go this time over on this side, and I don't necessarily have to be in the shader, I can be in layout mode and just view it through materials. So this object has no material. I'm going to go particles and new. And you'll see it's got an emitter and hair. And if I press on hair, it's going to add hair to my object. Now, depending on which mode we're in, if I go to render mode, you'll get slightly different looks. So we can play with the length of the hair. So I'm actually going to turn it down a bit so it's not as long. We can play with whether it regrows over time in animations. We can play with the number of hair follicles. Now just a warning here, if you turn this up too high and you don't have a very powerful computer, you might crash your computer because the more follicles you add, the harder it is for render. Now as I go down, there's some different things I can play with. So I'm going to turn on children and interpolated. You'll notice I start to get a lot more fluffy looking object. I can also play with things like clumping. So clumping makes hair stick together. So you can experiment with clumping. You can also change like parts. So how far it sticks apart. You can change the hair shape. So at the moment it's a strand, but I can play with my shape and get different results. And I can also do some other things, and this is where it's quite cool. So if I instead, this time you'll notice, because I've added particles, up the top here I can go into particle edit. Now in particle edit, I can actually start to comb this hair. So you'll notice I got tools like comb, smooth, add, length, puff, cut, and weight. So if I went to weight, I can look at how intense and how thick the hair is. But we're going to stick with the comb. So you'll notice if I drag it over, I can actually start to comb my object. Now, you might be like, oh, it's only showing me the black hair, and I want to see it puffy. So if I go down to options and turn on children, you'll notice I can actually see my hair. And as I comb it, I can change the shape. So I can actually comb the hair into different patterns. I can smooth it out. I can puff it back up, and it'll start to puff. Now I could also cut it if I didn't like it so long, so I can actually cut hair off in particular parts, and you'll see it'll trim the hair right off. So that was just using particle systems. Now even in here I have some options as well. So there are some more things like hair shape. I can play with the radius and the roughness of the hair, how it parts. I can change what it looks like in my render. So if I add more steps, it'll render at a higher amount. But you can see I can get like a colored object. Now I can actually give that color too. If I go to my color here, I can give that a color. So it's not white. you can have a look at a colored object. Now, with these different settings, what I would like you to do is have a go at putting textures or colors or playing with materials and adding them to your animal. Now, you might have a go at a specific texture. You can actually look up and experiment. So there's lots of different videos or lots of different settings for playing with textures. But to your dog and your other animal, I'd like you to have an experimentation and look at what you might add to it to make it different. You might even spend some time sculpting your object. So if I was just to open my dog up on my dog model, if I just select the dog itself, make sure, yeah, I've got my object here, and I'm just going to minimize my workspace. You might spend some time in sculpt mode, looking at your dog, and you might decide you want to round it a bit. So make sure you turn on dynamic typology, and you might start to add and shape your animal a bit more. Now just be careful, if you add lots and lots of topology in, it will make the file slower to render. It will take a bit more time to open and shut. It might cause problems with some of the computers that aren't as strong, but you might start shaping your object and making your dog look a bit better. Now you can see there I've had control, I've had it doing a subtract instead of an add, which hasn't really been doing what I wanted it to do. So this is where you can experiment a bit. You might improve your animal model, and then when you're finished, I want you to color it up the way you like it. Now you can split your animal in edit mode if you wanted different parts to be different colors. You could do a selection, so you could select by the faces in face select mode and just select a lot of faces. And if you wanted specific bits to be a different color, all you'll do is click on those, press P, separate the selection, and then that will allow you in object mode. You'll see I now have this part of my dog and this part of my dog. If I wanted this to be a different color, I can remove the old color and just for example, add in a completely different color, and you'll see that now that bit is different. So what I'd like you to do to your animals is add a bit more color. You might add some more features like eyes or a nose, color them, improve their appearance, and then render out a finished animal to put into to submit as your work. All right, until next time.